Some people like to say that if God was all good and loving, he would destroy evil. And if God is all powerful, he could destroy evil, but evil persists. Therefore, there isn't an all good, loving, and powerful God. In part 2 of my interview with Dr. Kirk McGregor, we're going to be looking at why God doesn't jump in and stop egregious evil from happening. I'm Kerry Decker, your host. We'll be right back. So let's kind of shift gears for a moment and ask this question, that if God is good and loving, then why doesn't he prevent egregious evildoers from doing evil? Why doesn't he stop Adolf Hitler? Why doesn't he stop Joseph Stalin? Why doesn't he stop the school shooter? Why doesn't God jump in and do something about this evil if he's all good and loving?
Yeah. I'd tell the person that they haven't thought through the logical consequences of God's preventing these evils.
Yeah.
And if they had, they would see that those consequences contradict God's being truly good and loving.
Mm-hmm.
So recall what I said earlier about the logical structure of libertarian freedom. It entails that its holders possess both the unconstrained ability to choose anything on the moral spectrum, from the greatest goods to the worst evils, and the unimpeded power to actualize their choices. But you might say, okay, but why is libertarian freedom important? Well, because libertarian freedom is the essence of the soul, namely the image of God, the imago Dei. We are in the image of God because, like God, we are souls, and so have the freedom to choose between the alternatives. Having libertarian freedom is a precondition for us either going to heaven or going to hell.
Yeah.
In contrast, animals are not in the image of God because they have no souls and thus lack the freedom to choose between the alternatives. Mm-hmm. Everything an animal does is determined by its genetic makeup and the input of its 5 senses. Yeah. Let me tell you a humorous story to illustrate the point. My wife had a cat named Augie who was grossly overweight. It severely impeded his ability to jump normal distances, and he walked by a mirror every day. I frequently commented to my wife that if Augie had libertarian freedom, he would freely reflect, I can't jump distances that I see all these other cats jumping. I see that I'm much larger than all these other cats. I'm going on a diet. Nonetheless, whenever Augie saw food, his genetic makeup and the input of his 5 senses told him to eat, and he could not do otherwise since all he was his body. Yeah. But I, namely my soul, can defy my genetic makeup and the input of my 5 senses and refuse to eat. Yeah. And I have special awareness of this because I suffer from a neurobiological disease known as obsessive-compulsive disorder, particularly the strain called purely obsessional OCD.
Yeah.
And part of dealing with that is resisting the obsessions that my brain throws at me each and every day. So if I was simply a brain, then there would be no way to treat obsessive-compulsive disorder. And this fact is actually recognized in the literature. Wow. One of the greatest scientific defenses of the human soul or human immaterial mind is written by one of the 2 American leading experts on OCD, Jeffrey Schwartz, in the book The Mind and Its Brain.
Yeah.
So, with that in mind, let's consider what God would have to do to stop someone like Hitler from carrying out the Holocaust.
Yeah.
God would have to remove Hitler's libertarian freedom by annihilating his soul and thus making him no longer in the image of God.
Yeah.
Hitler would then become a hominid animal, compelled by his brain to do everything he would in the future do. And when he died, that would be it. He would go to nothing.
Yeah.
And going to nothing is even worse than going to hell, because at least in hell you exist.
Yeah.
So what I've described is the greatest possible violation of another human being.
Yeah.
Far worse than murder, rape, torture, the Holocaust, or any other evil imaginable. For by murdering, raping, or torturing another person, or subjecting them to the Holocaust, you're not destroying that person's soul,
Yeah.
turning them into an animal, and preventing them from having eternal existence and the
Yeah.
possibility of being saved.
Yeah.
But annihilating a person's soul is the ultimate act of dehumanizing or animalizing, even worse than the Holocaust itself. So for God to stop Hitler from carrying out the Holocaust and unspeakable evil, God would have to stoop far lower than Hitler in carrying out the even worse evil of annihilating Hitler's soul.
Yeah.
Now, God's intervention would also mean Hitler would get away with all the lesser evils he had committed prior to the Holocaust, including the intent or mens rea to commit the Holocaust.
Yeah.
He would never pay for his unatoned for crimes in hell, which is horribly unjust.
Yeah.
So I would just summarize all this by saying if God were to intervene to stop evildoers, he would have to destroy their libertarian freedom and therefore their soul, which is a greater evil than whatever any human being could do. And in that case, God would not be truly good and loving.
Yeah, interesting. You know, I tell folks when they bring up this objection, and I said, you're far too selective, because you want God to jump in and stop Hitler and Stalin
Right.
and the school shooter,
Exactly.
and you want him to stop all of the evil that you abhor,
Yes.
but you don't want him to stop all of the evil that attracts you.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And you know, quite frankly, I am glad that God doesn't jump in and stop all evil from happening, because that means that I would have been obliterated a long time ago.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Well, how about let's talk a little bit about this issue of natural evil, you know, because and I'm not going to go into all the details, but one of the most heartbreaking stories I ever faced as a pastor in the ministry was a mother who had a baby who needed a heart transplant. Just to fast forward the story, is that finally another child died so this baby could get the heart transplant. The baby got the heart transplant, and the doctor said it was a textbook operation. It couldn't have gone any better.
Yeah.
A day later, the baby died. You know, and so, you know, this woman goes from extreme despair to being filled with elated hope, and then having the props knocked right out from underneath her again. Why does God let things like that happen? Cancer, natural disasters. It just seems like there's no good reason for it.
Right. Right.
You know.
So I think that evil and the others that you mentioned fall under this category of natural evil because they are due to natural causes. So here, let me return to my point about intrinsic perfection as an incommunicable attribute of God.
Okay.
By which I mean it's logically impossible for God to create anything possessing the property of intrinsic perfection. So what do I mean by intrinsic perfection? This means completeness or wholeness in each and every respect. Completeness or wholeness in each and every respect. This is an essential attribute of God. God clearly needs this, and it resides in God as necessary being. In other words, God must exist. It's impossible for God not to exist.
Yeah.
By contrast, contingent being, which means anything that doesn't have to exist, including everything created like the universe, is finite and limited in each and every respect. Hence, if God created anything intrinsically perfect, he would have to create another God, another necessary being.
Which is a contradiction.
Right, because
Yeah.
necessary being can't be created, since necessary being must always exist. So it makes as much sense that to say you can have a contingent necessary being as it does to have a round triangle or a married bachelor.
Yeah.
So the philosopher Ed Miller has written on this extensively, and he reasons like this. It's logically impossible to have a world without evil. Anything created by God would have to be less than God just by virtue of being dependent on
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
And this means immediately that it must be less than perfect. And this means immediately the presence of various kinds of imperfections. Now, natural evil is due to the intrinsic imperfections or defects of the universe,
Yeah.
including our bodies. Now, we get into the question of heaven. The only way the universe, including our bodies, would not display these defects is if God, so to speak, moved into the universe to overwhelm or make up for its resident imperfections. To illustrate my point, my desk right here lacks the intrinsic property of luminescence. However, when I turn on the light makes up for that lack by bestowing on the desk the property of luminescence so that I can see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But turn off the light and my desk is no longer luminescent. So why doesn't God right here and now move into the universe and make up for its resident imperfections? Because this would destroy libertarian human freedom. Let me explain why. Libertarian human freedom is only possible if God is at what you might call a metaphysical or epistemic distance from the universe, or at arm's length. So, to use technical language here, God is not definitively present in the universe. Definitive presence means God's exhibiting the qualitatively highest mode of his presence, where he fully displays his glory, loveliness, and majesty, as he currently does outside time and space.
Yeah.
Rather, God is what's called replatively present in the universe. Replative presence is a qualitatively lower mode of presence, where God is causally active and knows what is happening at, but does not fully display his glory, loveliness, and majesty at each space-time location. So if God currently were definitively present or moved into the universe, God's glory, loveliness, and majesty would infallibly prevent people from sinning and infallibly draw them to live out God's desires.
Yeah.
Persons could not choose for or against God, but would be compelled to do what God desires, which makes our genuine love for God impossible, because genuine love entails free choice. So a necessary precondition or lead up of having a heaven composed of creatures who made the decision to genuinely love God is having the universe currently as it is, with God at arm's length, and therefore the universe displaying its resident defects.
Yeah.
So I would say babies dying, people dying of cancer, and people's experiencing natural disasters, namely people experiencing the result of the universe's resident defects, can only be prevented at the cost of taking away our libertarian freedom and therefore our hope of heaven.
Yeah. So let me see if I can kind of like again connect the dots on this.
Yes.
I understand what, and I particularly like the illustration of the desk. I get that.
Yes.
You know, that is very helpful for me. And so I heard one guy once say this, is that this is not the best of all possible worlds, but it may be the best way to the best of all possible worlds. And so
Right.
this is like you say, the lead up to heaven. The book of Revelation, by the way, talks about now the dwelling of God is with men.
Right.
Okay.
So, that
hold your thought for a minute, because I want to make a connection here on this.
Right.
I once really struggled with this, and I went to a leading philosopher and I was seeking his answer. I said, "Well, then will we be free creatures in heaven?" What do you think?
Well, I would say that in heaven, we will not have the freedom to sin.
Yeah.
And the only way that that does not obliterate, say, the essence of the soul or the essence of humanity is if that decision to cut off the side of the spectrum where we have the ability to do evil is freely made by us. If we freely seal ourselves in that choice by saying, I make the decision that I want to kind of get rid of half of the spectrum from which I can choose, no one else can make that decision for you, only you, then the fact that you don't have it in heaven is the result of your own free choice. And so the fact that in heaven our choices are limited between the range of, say, doing absolute good and doing nothing at all and anything in between, that decision to truncate our freedom was itself made by us.
Yeah, and freely made by us. Yeah.
Obliteration of freedom.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I the way that I resolved it in my own mind was just simply this, is that if I had cancer and I went through the experience of having the disease of cancer, and then if I was cured of that cancer, I would never say, oh, I wish I could go back to those good old days when I had cancer.
Exactly.
You know? You know? And having had this experience of evil, you know, I'm getting older, and when I look at all of the stuff that goes on in life, both moral evil and natural evil, I find it to just be very wearisome. It just breaks my heart, and I see that there is no cure for it this side of eternity. You know, so other than redemption,
right.
You know, so that and when I reflect on my own experience, I've had protest against God my whole Christian life. This whole problem of evil has been a protest, a big protest for me. And I'm talking about serious protest, not just a little mild one, my whole Christian life. And I finally understood my big beef with God is just simply this. He didn't make earth heaven.
Right.
You know? And so,
but that assumes that it's logically possible for God to have made earth heaven, which on my analysis is not.
I know, and I get it. I get it. In the meantime, it's difficult. It really is to go through this great tribulation, if you will, of living life on earth. You know? Right. So that's great. So how about any additional thoughts? We're almost out of time here, Kirk. First of all, I want to just say that it's been an immense pleasure for me to kind of like spend some time with you on this, because I know you're a guy who thinks deeply about these things, and you're equipped with the faculties that a guy like me doesn't have, you know, but I'm able to apprehend that if I can talk to somebody like you who gets this stuff.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. There are two final thoughts that I wanted to share. Actually, three final thoughts that I wanted to share. Okay. One goes back to something that you said about nobody wants God to step in and intervene with the evil that they want to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely true. If God intervened and stopped any of us from doing evil beforehand, then making the decision to commit any sin turns out to be worse than the so-called unforgivable sin described by Jesus in Mark 3.
Yeah.
One thing that my brain has thrown at me as an obsession throughout the years is the prospect. Have I committed the unforgivable sin?
I think we all have thought that. You know?
Yeah, but at least if you commit the unforgivable sin, you have the hope of future existence. Yeah. You'll exist in hell, but at least you'll still be there. But if God intervened and stopped any of us from doing evil beforehand, destroying my soul, none of us can truly bear the thought of that dreadful prospect. So when someone says, yes, I want God to intervene and stop evildoers from doing evil beforehand, then I reply, okay, put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah.
Be willing. The next time you decide to tell a lie, the next time you decide to look at someone other than your spouse lustfully, next time you decide to cheat on your taxes,
or you get cut off in traffic and you feel like you need to wave at that person.
You'll be violated far worse than going through the Holocaust by literally being dehumanized. No hope at all. And no one is really willing to step up to that plate. I would also say, secondly, that the Christian worldview provides an unambiguous yes to the question, will God respond to each evil? So, as you said, at the day of the Lord, when Jesus returns, God moves into the universe and makes heaven and earth one reality, the new heaven and new earth described in Revelation. Most evils will be responded to then. However, it is the case that often God graciously provides foretastes of the new heaven and new earth by responding to evils beforehand, though not through such an overwhelming display of his glory that it wipes out human free will. So the real question is, when will God respond to each evil? Will he respond at the end of the age, as with most evils, or will he give a foretaste of the new heaven and new earth by responding immediately after the evil transpires? To the answer to all these questions is simple, at least for me as a Molinist, and that is that God chooses to respond to each evil at the point when it would best contribute to achieving an optimal balance between saved and lost. That is, to producing a world containing no more of the lost than necessary to achieve the maximal number of the saved. And if God is all-loving, then that's what God's overriding desire would be. So only the Christian worldview gives you the hope that at the end of the day, all evil is remedied. And God's overarching desire of bringing about maximal salvation is achieved. And then finally, if any high school students are in our audience and interested in these topics, I would love to have you as one of my students here at McPherson.
There you go.
We've got a major in philosophy and religion. We've got a major in religion, politics, and law. So check out the college website at www.mcpherson.edu. I'd love to see you.
I'll make sure that comes up on the screen so folks can find the link to that.
All right.
Before we wrap up, I want to come back to one of the things that you said actually in point number 2, where you were talking about the issue of justice. Ultimately there be a remedy to that.
Right.
And, that's one of the great things, or one of the things that I feel is a strong argument for God's existence, because I do a lot of work with children who have been trafficked. I've been to Cambodia many, many times, and I've worked with an organization that has ministers to trafficked children, and not always are the perpetrators brought to justice.
Yes.
And so you take God out of the picture, then what do you end up with? Well, you end up with the reality that too bad, you're just out of luck. You factor God back into the picture, and that no one escapes justice.
Yes.
Outside of the hope that we will find redemption and forgiveness for our sins.
Right.
And so, man, Kirk, has been a blessing talking with you today. I appreciate you taking some time.
It's been a blessing for me to speak with you and to
That's great.
To be with the audience that's out there.
Yeah. We're going to have to do this again sometime if you'd be open to it. I'd love to talk with you more.
Yes.
That's great. There's plenty of great content here, not only Kirk's presentation, but other presentations with respect to this whole question of God and his existence. Yeah, we all have our struggles with this, and particularly this whole question of the problem of evil. But I'm telling you right now, if your thinking has not been challenged today by listening to Dr. McGregor, then you probably were asleep. so make sure you come back for more great content here on 5 Good Reasons Why God Exists. I'll see you next time.